to encourage you, if you would, to open your Bibles. You'll need your Bibles this morning. And open them to the 23rd chapter of the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 23. Now, our focus today, and this is going to be a two-part lesson, is if you haven't had opportunity to be here this evening, I'd encourage you to change your plans. Because I want to talk about part of Matthew 24 this morning, and we'll finish up after lunch. And I'm going to try to hurry through this, but I'm not, even though it sure does smell good from here. I tell you what, I've seen all kinds of good stuff back there for lunch. So we'll be looking forward to that. This morning's part of Matthew chapter 24 begins back in chapter 23. And the reason that I'm really thinking about this passage is that I constantly hear people talking about those things that are going to happen before Jesus' return. And it seems like every time we have a war or we have something happen in our world, there are those who are coming out and they are saying, well, you know, you hear wars and rumors of wars, and if you will buy my book, if you will buy my video, if you will just listen to me and send me your money, I'm going to explain all of this to you. And they go back to several passages. Matthew 24 is one of the primaries. And talk about the wars and rumors of wars, the earthquakes and the pestilence and all that's noted within that context. Now, we understand that we kind of like to know what's going to happen after a while. We also understand that we don't like secrets. We like to know what's going on. Now, that's true in the matters of the world, and it's also true religiously and about the teachings about the second coming of Christ. Many people, of course, as I have just noted, believe that Jesus told us that he would return and told us of the signs and the wonders of that return. Now, to gain a better understanding, and again, when we study God's Word, we need to keep things in context. In other words, what is being said, to whom is it being said, and what are they talking about? So, when we look at the 23rd chapter of the book of Matthew, now I'm not going to read all this. Some of you have already read it. I noted this Wednesday night. But he begins by exposing the apostasy of the Pharisees. As we look through this, if I can get it to work, it's not going to work. He goes through there and he gives us some insight into what we note, beginning in verse 13, as the 8 woes. In other words, he is condemning them of their actions and their activities. Now, when we get down to about verse 34, and I want to read verses 34 through 36, because that truly fits into the context of Matthew 24. Now remember, Matthew was written. There were no chapters. There were no verses. Those were added later. So we look about here, he's condemning the Pharisees. He's dealing with their false teaching and the things that have been done in the past. How they had mistreated God's law. How they had mistreated the prophets. And then we get down to verse 34. Matthew chapter 23. He says, therefore, behold. Here we go. Matthew 23. Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them will kill and crucify. Some of them will scourge in your synagogues and persecute you from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all unrighteous blood shed on the earth. For the blood of righteousness, able to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. So he's noted all these things. And if you didn't read it already, go back and read Matthew 23. He said, look, y'all are guilty. This is what you've done. And something's going to come upon you. Now I want you to look at verse 36, because verse 36 is key to understanding the first portion of Matthew chapter 24. Verse 36, Matthew 23. He says, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Now I want you to put that in your mind. All these things will come upon this generation. Now the Jews had killed God's people in the past. The current generation was killing God's people. They were killing one another. There were so many misdeeds, and they were guilty of them. All of these things. And the punishment for killing God's people, as we note here, will come upon this generation. Now, the apostles were a little shocked. We're moving into chapter 24. When Jesus was talking to them about the temple. In Matthew 24 and verse 1, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away with his disciples, and came up to a point out of the temple building to him. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Now, the disciples were saying, look how glorious the temple is. 40 years they've been working on this temple. It was beautiful. Some of the places had gold on the outside of it. They had these beautiful pillars. It was built out of stones that would have weighed tons. And Jesus said that it's all going to be torn down. Well, they were struggling with this. They didn't really understand what Jesus was talking about. So they made a query. In Matthew 24, in verse 3, it says that as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, now listen to this. This is another key to understanding what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24. He says, they say, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? 3 questions. When will this happen? What is the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? That's 3 things that Jesus is going to answer to these individuals. Now, as we read through the Gospels, it becomes evident that Jesus answered questions that were not actually posed, if you will. They thought they knew what they were asking, but Jesus explains it as what they need to hear. And in Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 through 34, he answers the question about what was going to happen in this generation. And he was talking about the temple and its destruction. Now, this afternoon, we want to talk about verses 36 and going on down into chapter 25, where he addresses the conclusion to this questioning. What's going to happen? Tell us when these things are going to happen. So, in Matthew 24, beginning there in verse 4, he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. What's going to happen to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all of these individuals? Jesus warned his disciples that the destruction of Jerusalem would be soon in their generation. Now, Matthew 23, 26, we just read it. Truly I say to you, all things will come upon this generation. And then we go down to the end of this first answer, or actually the second question. And he says, truly I say, well, this is the first question, excuse me. He says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Now, the word generation, this generation, does not refer to an extended age, but it is referring to the people who are living at the time that Jesus is speaking. And understand, Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. They should understand what he's saying. Now, we see an example of this same thing back in Matthew chapter 11 in verse 16. He says, but to what shall I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace, who call out to other children and say, we played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a gluttonous man, a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. That was talking about those people at that time, that generation. Now, later, down in Matthew chapter 16, In verse 28, he says, "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here, this generation," is what it's talking about, "who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." So it's going to happen with this generation. Now, remember, he began that when he talked about the Pharisees, the Jews. And in verse 24 of 24, he repeats it, this generation. So we're talking about something that was going to happen in their lifetime. That's what he's talking about. He's answering the question. When are these things going to happen? And what are the signs of it? The times leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem would be unusual. In Matthew chapter 24, starting there in in verse 6, he says, you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. If you go back and read history, Tacitus wrote, who is a historian, not inspired, a historian, that in AD 70, that there was a period of disasters, wars, evil strife, horrible things. There were 3 civil wars, much less the wars with enemies, and often wars of both characters at once. By the time of AD 70, the children of Israel were literally at war with one another, the factions of Judaism. They were taking one another's lives. Now, somebody's going to say, well, do you have that history book? And the answer is yes. I started to bring all my history books this morning, but I just decided, well, if they don't believe me, I'll bring them next time. And then now you can get most of these online, these history books. In addition, Josephus, who was a Jew, and he wrote history for the Romans. He followed along. He was there when Jerusalem fell in AD 70. He recorded what was happening. You can go back and read Josephus's war, or the Jewish war. Now, somebody will ask, do you have that? I do. You can get it online. It's about that thick. It's about this big. And it's really small print. But yeah, you can read it. It's easier to go online so I make it bigger and see it. He noted in his writings about the conflicts and the battles that the Jews endured. He talked about all of the difficulties, all of the earthquakes. Tacitus wrote about the terribleness of the earthquakes and the famine, the shortages of food, and how people were starving to death in places in the land. between 65 and 66. Taccius wrote that heaven too marked the crime-stained year with tempest and pestilence. Pestilence is illness, kind of like what we just went through, pandemic stuff. He writes that in places the plague was so bad that the stench of the dead bodies was overpowering. Now I'm putting this in a smaller version. You can go back and read all of this. Persecution was a reality. All of these things happened prior to Jerusalem falling in AD 70. History notes it. Then it talks about, in verse 9 of Matthew 24, then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many, because lawlessness is increasing. Most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, history fulfills and verifies all of these things. Think about the Romans and how they persecuted the Christians, especially Nero. You know, they would put them in the Colosseum. They killed Christians everywhere with the blessings of the Jews. In Acts chapter 5, it notes how the high priest rose up and laid hands on the apostles, put them in prison, beat them. Stephen was murdered in Acts 7. King Herod killed James, the brother of John, in Acts 12. And Peter was captured in chapter 12 of Acts. The Jewish leaders brought Paul before the Sanhedrin in Acts 22. He was then sent to Felix in 24, and then to Festus, and then on to King Agrippa. Now, Justin's Book of Martyrs talks about all of these things. History books. History verifies these things being fulfilled. These predictions have been supported through time between AD 50 and AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed. In addition to these general signs, Jesus gives the disciples specific signs to watch for, which would tell them that the destruction of that in their generation would come. In Matthew 24:14, it says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." Now, it will be preached to all nations. And it's been noted that this denotes in the known world. And the message went out. The gospel went quickly. It was not something that was slow. Now, Paul stated that this was accomplished in Colossians chapter 1. In verse 21, although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds, yet he was now reconciled you in his fleshly body through death, in order to present you before him holy and blameless beyond reproach. If indeed you continue in the faith, firmly established and steadfast, not moving away from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made minister. And this all took place just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, that which was prophesied as the abomination of desolation in Daniel chapter 9. Now Luke's account of these matters, over in chapter 21 and verse 20, also notes that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Now, Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. And when they saw that, they knew that times were getting dire, if you will. And you need to pay heed to this. Now, there's a whole lot more. If you go back and study history of what was going on in Judea, in that whole area, before they went to Jerusalem and surrounded it the second time. These signs would give those who paid heed to them an advantage or an advance warning. And he talks about the parable of the fig tree in Matthew 24:32 through 33. In other words, when it happens, be ready. Verse 32. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branches are already become tender and putting forth its leaves, you know it's summer. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. When they saw these signs, Jesus urged them to flee from Jerusalem. And if you go back and read through Matthew 24, verses 15 through 22, it notes that when you see the army around Jerusalem, that you need to flee to the mountains. Verse 16. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get things out that are in his house, but whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter nor on the Sabbath. In essence, he's saying when you see him here, it's time to go. And don't have anything that hinders you from your leaving. Verse 21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of time, or beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days have been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days would be cut off. Now, General Silicius came to Jerusalem. You can read this in Josephus. He come up to the city. They seen the Roman army. Well, he finally decided, now this is a very short version, he finally decided that he could not besiege Jerusalem. So he left. And history tells us that there were people in Jerusalem who left in just droves and went to the mountains. Then Titus brings his army. And when Titus comes, they besiege Jerusalem. So we kind of have this little interim that's talked about here, where the Christians who understood this, who left, and they did not delay. In the least, they did not delay. Now, it's also noted here in verse 24, chapter 24, verse 23, that if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, and there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in their room, do not believe him. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, the vultures will gather. Quickly, the word vulture, also translated eagles. Eagle's a good translation because it denotes the banner of the Roman army. So there's going to be a lot of false teachers. And of course, history notes all of these false teachers, false prophets, false Christ. And he says, look in verse 25. You've been told. According to history, Christians heeded their master. And while severe, was limited only to Jerusalem and the nation of Israel. In verse 25 it says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. And they were going to be dealt with. It was going to be destroyed. The temple, all of it was going to be gone. And history tells us that all of it was destroyed. Everything. The Romans came in and literally stripped the gold off the walls. They burnt the temple. They made sacrifices in the Holy of Holies. And they used the pig, which was the desolation, the abomination of desolation. It was all torn out. We're talking huge blocks were gone. They literally got rid of everything that was there. History, go back and read it, will give you more knowledge of what happened. So, we're looking here in Matthew 24, about verse 4, and going down to about verse 34, 35. What's he talking about? In this generation, when these people were alive, this was going to happen. And it did. Jerusalem was destroyed. Now we can go back and we can study concerning about the law of Moses being nailed to the cross, being fulfilled. We can talk about the rip in the Holy of Holies. But it was over. It was fulfilled. It was done away with. So here's what it's teaching in these 2 points. When will this happen? What will the signs be? He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in their generation. All these things happened that Jesus said. History proves it out, verifies it. Now, people, for sordid gain, take these verses completely out of context to note that it's something that's going to happen in the future. When in reality, it's already happened. Now we're going to talk about the future part, answer to the future question after lunch. But all these things, the wars, the rumor of wars, all of those things that took place in that generation with the destruction of Jerusalem. The other day, someone was talking about Daniel chapter 9. And they were talking about the goat and the lamb, or the bull and the goat. And who are these? Well, if you go back and just read the context of Daniel, it tells you who they were. Already happened. Nothing in the future. The Jews fulfilled their mission. It was done. It was over. And everything in Jerusalem was destroyed. And Christianity bloomed and was taught all over the world. Don't leave out before this afternoon, because we're going to talk about the end of the world after lunch. Dear friends, if there is a need on your heart this day that we can assist you with in any way, please let that need be made known. Come now, as together we stand and as we sing.